at sce.com/stay safe.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
Major props to the Clippers. They had to win their final 2 regular season games on the road, and they got it done. The Clippers beat Golden State 124-119 in overtime Sunday to clinch the 5th seed in the Western Conference playoffs. The Clippers will play Denver in the first round. Game 1 in the best-of-7 series is Saturday at Denver. James Harden led the Clippers with 39 points and 10 assists, 33 points for Kawhi Leonard in 47 minutes. Folks, let me say this. If Kawhi Leonard can avoid any issues, his win was the Clippers' 8th in a row. They are 18-3 since March 5th. The Clippers are playing like they're ready for the postseason. The Lakers secured the number 3 seed in the Western Conference. Their first-round opponent is Minnesota. Game 1 of their best-of-7 series is Saturday at Crypto.com. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. More news, opinions, and conversation when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
Hey, this is Zoe Williams, the voice of reason, and for over 20 years, Parkside Economic Development Corporation has served Leimert Park and surrounding communities, empowering tomorrow's leaders and changing lives. Parkside EDC has awarded over $400,000 in college scholarships while sharing economic principles of the Big Five of money with students and their families. Parkside EDC partners with organizations like the Brotherhood Crusade to assure our youth have the financial acumen to succeed. Parkside EDC provides families and businesses with financial insights, offering free online, on-site, and on-air B-Warp presentations. The Black Wealth Attainment and Retention Programs helps our community acquire, sustain, and pass down legacy wealth. High school seniors can apply for this year's scholarship awards at parksideedc.org. Scholarships will be awarded at Parkside EDC's Gospel/Jazz Brunch on Sunday, April the 27th. For details, tickets, or donations, please visit parksideedc.org. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
I'm Tavis, Smiley. Glad to have you with us in this second hour of our program. As promised, following that spirited first hour, a conversation now with Brooklyn College distinguished professor and New York Times bestselling author Theo Harris on her new text, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life of struggle outside of the South. It is true that Dr. King had a turbulent and terrible time trying to organize above the Mason-Dixon line. I'm delighted to have for the hour Professor Theo Harris to discuss King of the North. Professor Theo Harris, how are you today?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. I'm always delighted to be in conversation with you. I appreciate your work over the years on King, and I'm delighted to have this conversation with you in this hour about this new one, King of the North, King's life of struggle, again, outside of the South. Tell me, obviously so much has been written about Dr. King, and his work in some ways is inexhaustible, his work in witness, I should say. But tell me how this became the frame for the new book.
So it starts, I would say, about 15 years ago. I was actually doing a project on the Black freedom struggle in Los Angeles in the decade before the Watts Uprising. So I was looking at particularly the struggle to around school segregation in LA, because there was a very robust movement, as many of your listeners may or may not know, in LA in the early 60s against LA's segregated schools. also against LA's segregated housing, and also against police brutality in the 60s. And this is before Watts. And so I'm doing this research and I'm looking at, LA had two black newspapers in the 50s and 60s, and that's the LA Sentinel and the California Eagle. And as I'm charting this movement, I keep finding Dr. King over and over in the city, calling out police brutality in LA, calling out school segregation in LA, calling out housing segregation in LA in 62, 63, 64. And I was like, wait a sec. This is not the story we were given in all of these books. The story we're given in all of these books, right, is, right, we begin in Montgomery and there's struggle and there's hardship, and Dr. King, in Albany, in Birmingham, and St. Augustine, and Selma, right? And we get the Civil Rights Act, and then we get the Voting Rights Act. And then as the story goes, in nearly every book, right, then a week after the Voting Rights Act is signed, Watts erupts and King is shocked, according to this story, and he is forced to realize that sort of the northern black people had been, as this story goes, left out, and then he turns north. And that is a convenient story, and we can talk about how it's a comfortable story, but it is not a true story. So it was really finding him over, and so he is in LA more than 15 times before the Watts uprising. Standing with all sorts of movements there, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, to you said the word comfortable. Tell me, I don't want to wait. Tell me, I don't want the audience to wait. Tell me right now why that story is so convenient and comfortable, that frame.
So I think it's convenient and comfortable for a few reasons. One, I think the dominant story we tell of King is one of struggle, but ultimately of the kind of triumph, of conquering injustice, of an America that sees injustice and changes it, right? And that story, again, it's like this decade of struggle, but then we get these two like landmark pieces of legislation. And so I think part of what's comfortable about that is it fits with a kind of notion of American democracy that is a kind of ever improving, right? And we might have problems, but then we fix them. And then I think the other way it's comfortable is this notion that King does it the right way, and he's respectable and he's beloved. And so when you do things the right way and you point out injustice the right way, then this country changes. Then people recognize it, and then things change. And I think to tell a much more accurate story, to tell a story of King of the North, which is happening at the same time as that story, is to tell a harder story. It's a story where injustice is not by and large resolved, where it's allowed, where it's protected, where some of the good guys, right, northern journalists, many northern liberals, right, who are pointing out the need for change in the South, who push for change at the South, at the very same time are protecting and maintaining segregation at home, even when it's pointed out, called for, challenged by the likes of Dr. King. So this notion that there's a right way, and if you do it the right way, that it's much more complicated and much more sobering.
I'm watching my clock. Watching my clock. Tell me this right quick, and we'll move. We'll continue when we come forward. But when you say the right way, I know what you mean. But so the audience is on the same page with me. What's the right way?
Well, I think there's this notion that King is respectable, that he knows how to do things right. He is. He goes about pushing for change in an acceptable way. That's the story we're given, right? That story is then rolled out against Black Lives Matter, against protests today, right? Oftentimes against young activists. You're not doing it like Dr. King. Well, I think when you look at the King of the North, you see that King is being criticized for the very same things that young activists are today, and that in fact this right way is not so right when it's in the backyards of northern liberals, northern journalists, or even Lyndon Johnson outside the South.
That's what I needed. When we come forward, we'll spend the rest of this hour talking about the King of the North, King's life of struggle outside of the South. It's an interesting frame. Nobody has taken on this particular topic in the way that Professor Theo Harris has, and I'm delighted to have her on for the rest of the hour. You're listening to Tavis Smiley.
From California to the Carolinas, everybody's listening to Tavis. More when we come forward.
Robinhood Gold members can now enjoy the VIP treatment, receiving a 3% IRA match on annual retirement contributions. With Robinhood Gold, the perks of the high net worth are now available for any net worth. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. To receive a 3% boost on annual IRA contributions, sign up at Robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold $5 a month for 1 year from first match. Must keep funds in IRA for 5 years. Go to Robinhood.com/boost. Robinhood Financial LLC member SIPC. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold LLC.
Make a move into a home of your own. With City National Bank's Ladder Up Home Loan Grant, you could receive up to $20,000 that you never need to pay back. Use it toward your down payment, save on closing costs, or to buy down your mortgage rate. Find out more at cnb.com/ladderuphome. City National, here for every stage of the journey. Property must be in a qualifying market in California, New York, or New Jersey. Additional terms and conditions apply. Not all applicants will qualify. Terms are subject to change without notice. City National Bank is an equal housing lender. Member FDIC. NMLS number 536994.
Before the fire, Altadena was a real-life Wakanda. A thriving black oasis just 15 miles from downtown Los Angeles. 80% black residents were homeowners, building intergenerational wealth against the odds. It was a hub of black-owned businesses, churches, and cultural institutions. It stood as a symbol of black resilience and economic independence. Then, in a matter of hours, it was gone. The fire tore through homes, swallowed businesses, and left behind a painful void. But was it just an unstoppable act of nature, or was negligence involved? Did officials ignore early warning signs? Were the response efforts delayed or insufficient? What role, if any, did corporate or government failures play? Survivors are demanding answers. Don't miss our KBLA Talk 1580 Town Hall. The Eden Altadena Fire, 100 days and counting, on Wednesday, April 16th, 4 to 6 p.m. at the Robinson Park Recreation Center, 1081 North Fair Oaks in Pasadena. Join Dominic DePrima, Nee Cordelai Corte, James Farr, Tavis Smiley, and a panel of survivors, community leaders, and experts as we commemorate Day 100 since the wildfires flared up, and we discuss where we go from here. It's KBLA's Eden Altadena Fire, 100 Days and Counting Town Hall, Wednesday, April 16th, 4 to 6 p.m. at the Robinson Park Recreation Center in Pasadena. Light refreshments to follow. Admission is free, but sign-up is required at our KBLA1580.com website. The first 100 attendees will receive a complimentary air purifier. This is a community call to action, brought to you by KBLA Talk 1580 and Quinn Emanuel Trial Lawyers. At KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your black. More honesty than you can handle. More empowerment than you can imagine. You're tuned in to Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley and Gene Theo Harris, who's author of the new book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life of struggle outside of the South. So I think I want to move in this direction, if I can, Professor Theo Harris, and that is how the framing of King in the South came to be, and why heretofore nobody else has wanted to wrestle with his movement in the North, out West. Why now is what I'm asking.
Well, I think why now? I think one of the things that I came to recognize, in part because I started, where this project started was not with a project on King, but a project on LA, and a project that started in the Black press and started with Black oral histories. And so then I discover King all over the place, talking about, for instance, the murder of Ron Stokes in 1962 by the police and the need for, to replace Chief Parker and police brutality, about the kind of school segregation we have in LA in the 60s, and arguably today. But I start in the Black press. And then I think one of the things that we have believed about King, which we don't believe about Malcolm X, if we were doing a research project, Tavis, me and you, on Malcolm X, we would know that the mainstream white press is not necessarily a trust is, might be a hostile source. We would be reading for, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, not necessarily as a trusted source on Malcolm, right? Or if we were doing a project on the Panthers. But with Martin Luther King, there has been a tendency, in part because the mainstream media begins to do a better job by the late 50s and 1960s in terms of the South, that we have missed the ways that they fell down on the job outside of the South. That many of the criticisms we would make, for instance, of the Montgomery Advertiser. The Montgomery Advertiser is terrible on the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And so there's a general wisdom now, right, that Southern newspapers couldn't cover the civil rights movement in the South, right? They were biased, they were limited, they were invested in sort of dismissing or even demonizing the Southern civil rights movement. But when you look, those very kind of mainstream national newspapers, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, like the LA Times, that might have done better on the Southern civil rights movement, fall down on the job when you turn towards segregation in LA, to the movement in LA, to the movement in New York, in the movement in Boston, and the movement in Detroit. And so part of why now is in part a question about learning to, in many ways, take apart those sources that we have seen as trustworthy, to see that in fact they had particular framings, they were invested in particular framings. Most of those national news outlets had almost no Black reporters in this period. And so again, even though, and I think certainly in many places in the South, right, they come to do very serious reporting, and they come to, and journalists are very courageous, but when it gets closer to home, they take a very different approach. They accept what public officials say. In the South, they're not doing that. They tend to see activists as troublemakers. They start to see Black activists in the South as a movement, as more noble. And so that the first way to begin this project, and where I began this project, was by coming to see the mainstream media as an ideological source that was in fact oftentimes invested in maintaining and kind of obscuring kind of segregation across the rest of the country. And then therefore seeing activists, including Dr. King, when he's calling out segregation outside of the South, as a troublemaker, as an outside agitator.
And I got 2 or 3 questions in my head all at one time. Let me start with this one. How did King navigate being boxed in that way by the mainstream media?
So he does a couple of things. The thing that kind of convinced me to do the book was realizing that Dr. King actually writes a column in the Amsterdam News, a bi-weekly column beginning in 1962 through 1966, and then he writes a column in the Chicago Defender. So one of the things that Dr. King is doing is creating a space to tell a different story. And some of that is about the South, absolutely. But some of that, so one of my favorite pieces is a piece that Dr. King writes in April of 1964 about the spate of school boycotts that we're seeing in the North. As you may know, in October of 1963, about 250,000 students in Chicago stay out of school to protest Chicago's segregated schools. Again, for our listeners, that's the same number who had gone to the March on Washington 2 months earlier. And then in February of 1964, there is a massive school boycott in New York, almost 500,000, and big school boycotts in Boston and Chicago, in many cities across the country. And they engender a tremendous amount of criticism. The New York Times calls the New York school boycott reckless, unreasonable, violent, adult encouraged truancy, right? They are unhinged about the New York City school boycott. So much so that Dr. King in April writes a piece in the Amsterdam News talking about the importance of the school boycott, talking about the ways that it exposes the segregation in northern schools and and this is his quote from him, the thin veneer of northern racial self-satisfaction. And one thing I should say, when I use the word North, I'm using it the way Dr. King and many activists at the time did, which is to include the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, all of whom were invested in portraying themselves as not the South in terms of their racial politics, right? Invested in this idea that they were open and free and, both from the Civil War and then also from kind of Black migration, this like promised land. And so activists like Dr. King, but again, like activists across the country, would often use the word North to talk about that investment, again, from the West Coast to the Northeast, to portraying themselves as not the South, in part as a way to deflect attention to their own segregation and their own kind of racial discrimination.
You mentioned the schools in New York, but you lay this out quite nicely in the text. So King is crisscrossing the country. He's not, again, boxed into the South. He's crisscrossing the nation, supporting protests literally from the Northeast all the way out here where I sit right now in L.A. to the West Coast. What kinds of issues, what kinds of protests was King attaching himself to?
So I think Tavis, you're pointing to like an aspect of King's leadership that we haven't fully reckoned with, which is that King shows up to support other people's movements.
That's right.
I think that oftentimes we just think about King on the dais, on the pulpit, right? He has to be he's the one calling the shots and leading. And that's true some of the time. But a lot of the time, what Dr. King does is he shows up for other people that he sees as part of the work he can do, and what people want from him is again, like you're saying, that crisscrossing of Black people, and particularly Black parents, just like in the South, is school segregation, right? And part of what motivates Black migration outside of the South, in part, is looking for better schooling for people's kids, right? But what we see from LA to Chicago to Milwaukee to Detroit to Boston is schools systematically segregated. And by that, I mean a couple things. It means the distribution of resources. So again, Black people paying taxes and yet their kids getting like less per pupil spending than what the kids going to predominantly white schools. We see decrepit buildings. We also see Black people not being hired as teachers. So the percentage of Black people hired in the teaching force is much lower than the percentage of Black people in the population in these cities. And then we're seeing, in part because of increased migration in the post-war period, these Black schools becoming severely overcrowded, in part because the kind of Board of Eds in these cities are very invested in keeping schools segregated. So they're not willing to rezone. And so schools become so crowded in cities like LA and Chicago that they move to double session days. Now, what that means is that you're basically cutting the school day in half so that you can have two sets of kids go. So a group of Black kids go in the morning for 4 hours, and then a second group of Black kids go in the afternoon. As you might imagine, Black parents are outraged. And so what we're seeing, again, in cities like LA is, by 1963, we're seeing, in the summer of 1963, regular weekly marches to the Board of Ed to protest both unequal resources, overcrowding, lack of hiring of Black and Chicano teachers. King joins those protests. In fact, maybe the only time that the heads of all the national civil rights organizations, so James Farmer from CORE, James Foreman from SNCC, Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, and Martin Luther King actually join a march in LA in August protesting LA's school segregation. But again, that's not the story we tell, right? The story we tell of 1963 is the story of Birmingham. And yet at the same time that Dr. King is waging that fight in Birmingham, he is calling both LA and Chicago as segregated as Birmingham. He's joining movements in both LA and Chicago to protest segregated schools, overcrowded schools, decrepit schools in these cities. And he's also supporting, if we look at what he's doing in New York, he's supporting kind of radical interracial unions. So in 1959, Local 1199, if people know 1199 in New York, it's the Hospital and Healthcare Workers Union. Mm-hmm. It is interracial from its start in the 1930s. And in the late 50s, they decide to try to organize the lowest paid hospital workers in New York, which are predominantly Black and Puerto Rican women who are working double shifts as orderlies, right? So they come in the morning and clean, and then they come in the evening. They're making such low wages, to quote Dr. King, that you can't even call them wages. And so 1199 has decided to strike these hospitals because these women don't actually even have the right to strike. And they call on Dr. King in 1959, and he says, yes, count on me, call on me. So I think this is another, again, like fundamental to his leadership is if I can be helpful, let me know. And we see this with Local 1199, right? He will call 1199 his favorite union, in part because it's one of the unions that is actually walking the talk, which means that they are confronting racism in the workplace, they're confronting racism of their members, and they're willing to organize Black workers. Mm-hmm. He is also supporting what we would call, like, I think there's also a way that how we picture Dr. King's nonviolence has been really stripped and sanitized. Mm-hmm. So what Dr. King is supporting is obviously things like lunch counter sit-ins in the South, but he's also supporting school boycotts like we just talked about. Mm-hmm. He's supporting rent strikes. He's supporting disruptive, like, protests to disrupt construction sites, right? So he's supporting protests in New York City around construction work that's only hiring white construction workers. He's supporting protests around kind of, again, that are disrupting city life. In 1964, Brooklyn Core, right, which is a Brooklyn chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, decides they have been protesting housing segregation, school segregation, job discrimination for years and gotten very little change. And so they decide to do a stall-in on the freeways on the first day of the World's Fair, which is being held in Flushing Meadows in New York City, right? The World's Fair is a huge international event at this point. They're going to stall their cars on that first day to kind of draw attention to this persistent inequality. As you might imagine, Tavis, white moderates, Black moderates go crazy, right? This is a horrible thing to do. It's disruptive. They're roundly criticized. There's calls to, arrest them. They try to get Dr. King to come out against it. And Dr. King basically says no.
Hold that, Jean, hold that thought 1 second. Dr. King basically says no. We'll pick up the story there. We're talking about the new book from Jean Theo Harris, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life or struggle outside of the South. We'll let her finish that story when we come forward, and there are many more questions to ask, including how King was treated outside of the South, how he was treated in Cleveland, how he was treated in Chicago. Some of you know he was stoned in Chicago. So he goes up north, but how is he treated when he gets there? We'll talk about that in a great deal more when we come forward on Tavis Smiley.
This is getting good. Yeah, man. Tavis Smiley continues when we come forward.
I'm Bree Wood with 4 Things You Should Know with BIN News. Stocks surged on Wall Street after President Trump's surprise temporary tariff exemptions on smartphones, computers, and semiconductors. The Dow Jones rose about 400 points with the S&P 500 and NASDAQ also climbing. An all-female crew, including Black aerospace engineer Aisha Bowe and TV personality Gayle King, returned from a Blue Origin flight to the edge of space. The event was historic as the last all-female crew involved a solo Russian cosmonaut in 1963. Suspected U.S. airstrikes in Yemen killed at least 6 and wounded dozens. The Pentagon hasn't confirmed, but the military has targeted Houthi rebels for their attacks on Red Sea shipping supporting Hamas in Gaza. And Zendaya is set to play legendary singer, the late Ronnie Spector, in her biopic, Be My Baby, How I Survived a Mascara, Miniskirts, and Madness. The project will be directed by Black filmmaker Barry Jenkins. Get BIN News on demand 24/7 on the iHeartRadio app.
Southern California Edison reminds you that downed wires are dangerous. Never approach or touch a downed wire or anything in contact with it. Stay away and call 911. Learn more at sce.com/stay safe.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
Major props to the Clippers. They had to win their final 2 regular season games on the road, and they got it done. The Clippers beat Golden State 124-119 in overtime Sunday to clinch the 5th seed in the Western Conference playoffs. The Clippers will play Denver in the first round. Game 1 in the best-of-7 series is Saturday at Denver. James Harden led the Clippers with 39 points and 10 assists, 33 points for Kawhi Leonard in 47 minutes. Folks, let me say this. If Kawhi Leonard can avoid any issues with his right knee, the Clippers are going to make some serious noise in the playoffs. Sunday's win was the Clippers' 8th in a row. They are 18-3 since March 5th. The Clippers are playing like they're ready for the postseason. The Lakers secured the number 3 seed in the Western Conference. Their first-round opponent is Minnesota. Game 1 of their best-of-7 series is Saturday at Crypto.com. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. More news, opinions, and conversation when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
I'm Reverend Gerald, the life coach. Is someone you love struggling with addiction and mental illness? Is improving your family's health important? Want to leave a legacy that your family can grow? Are you ready to enhance your perception of life experiences? Then wake up weekends at 7 a.m. with Urban Family Focus and get the wisdom, opportunity, resources, and motivation to live your best life. Join the conversation on Urban Family Focus Saturday and Sunday at 7 a.m.
Unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got your black. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Talk radio. That's music to your ears. We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
Got issues with youth or high school sports? Positive Coaching Alliance can help. PCA, a national nonprofit, offers more than 1,000 free online resources for youth and high school sports coaches, parents, students, and administrators. Visit PCADevZone.org.
The California Crusader newspaper would like to thank all of our subscribers for their support throughout the years, proudly serving the South Los Angeles and South Bay areas for more than 40 years. The California Crusader is a multicultural, black-owned, adjudicated newspaper that focuses on providing newsworthy information to the people in our community. We're constantly looking for ways to assist businesses in our community to connect with our subscribers. We provide low-cost, effective ways to promote your business with our reasonable and affordable advertising rates. You can participate by suggesting, sharing, and submitting your stories on the California Crusader newspaper Community Share Facebook group page, or visit our website at cal-cruise-news.com. That's calcruisenews.com. Then click on the Submit Now button located on the top right corner of the homepage, or text CCN to 42828. Again, text CCN to 42828. The California Crusader newspaper, working together to build a better community for our future. Subscribe today.
Time is up. The IRS is in full collection mode for 2024, issuing liens, levies, and garnishments to anyone who has a past tax debt or unfiled tax returns. Don't wait till it's too late. Your paycheck and bank accounts are at risk of being seized. Call now and stop the collection process today. If you're living check to check, no matter how much you're making, you still may qualify for the Fresh Start programs offered by the IRS to reduce or even eliminate your tax debt. It's just a 5-minute call to get your options, and it's free. If you owe back taxes, have years of unfiled tax returns, under audit, have a wage or bank levy, or finally just want to sleep better, business or personal, call the experts at Republic Tax Relief while there's still time. A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, and tough. This veteran-owned company has the fight you need to take on the IRS. Don't go at it alone. The call is free. Call their hotline number now, 800-652-1714. That's 800-652-1714. Find out if you qualify today. Call 800-652-1714 or go to republictaxrelief.com.
Helping to make you the most knowledgeable person in your circle of friends. This is Tavis Smiley.
You're asking, I'm sure, what can we do here in Detroit to help in the struggle in the South? Now the thing that you can do to help us down in Alabama and Mississippi and all over the South is to work with determination to get rid of any segregation and discrimination in Detroit. Realizing that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we've got to come to see that the problem of racial injustice is a national problem. No community in this country can boast of clean hands in the area of brotherhood. Now in the North it's different in that it doesn't have the legal sanction that it has in the South, but it has its subtle and hidden form. And it exists in three areas. In the area of employment discrimination, in the area of housing discrimination, and in the area of de facto segregation in the public schools. And we must come to see that de facto segregation in the North is just as injurious of the actual segregation in the South.
There you have MLK in his own words, echoing what Gene Theo Harris has put into print in this new book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life of struggle outside of the South. Gene, I want you to finish your story right quick, and then I want to get to that clip we just played of Dr. King.
Okay. Should we start with the clip or the story?
No, I want you were telling the story, and I had to cut you off when we went to break. I want you to finish your story, then we'll jump to the clip. Yeah.
So in 1964, just to recap the story, Brooklyn Corps is proposing a stall-in on the first day of the World's Fair, which is happening at Flushing Meadows in New York City, right? The World's Fair is an international event, and Brooklyn Corps has spent years trying to highlight these issues that we heard Dr. King talking about right there, schools, housing, jobs, and it's gotten very little change. And people go crazy. Robert Moses, right, who is the, New York City commissioner, the mayor, the newspapers, black moderates, everyone's like, this is a horrible thing to do. And they try to get King to come out against it. And King refuses. And he says, we do not need allies more devoted to order than to justice, right? So he's kind of picking up that thread that we know from the letter from Birmingham jail. And then he says, I've heard a lot of talk that our direct action alienates our friends. Dr. King, if they can kind of trap him in the South, and then the second that he opens his mouth about what's happening in these cities, they're like, basically, you don't belong here. Yeah. You should never have come. That's inappropriate, right? And they don't listen to him, and they reject all of it. I think this...
That's I'm not tell the story of King being in Cleveland, and you know this stuff as well as I do, Gene Theo Harris. He's in Cleveland campaigning for Carl Stokes, and Carl Stokes wins the election, and he tells King, goes to King's hotel room at the Sheraton and says, "I'm going downstairs to give my victory speech. I'm going to call for you to come down and stand next to me." He never did call King. So again, he wanted King to campaign for him, but he lied to King.
No, Tavis, he didn't. In fact, early on, he says no, he doesn't want them, and they come anyway.
That's correct.
And in fact,
that is correct.
Right? Like, this is what's so interesting. That's, I think so many people talk about that Carl Stokes thing, right? Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, part of a Carl Stokes thing, how he wins is white support. When you actually look, right, at how Carl Stokes wins that primary, it's because of unbelievable black turnout, right, Tavis?
That's right. No question. And the only point I was making was he was okay taking advantage, exploiting King being there campaigning for him, but he doesn't honor King by allowing King to stand next to him. So to your point, King has become toxic in these he is in fact toxic in some of these northern places. But the story I'm really pressing toward about Cleveland isn't really about Carl Stokes. King is in the car one day driving through Cleveland. You know this story. And he comes to a stop sign, and there are literally on the corner, standing there, some black prostitutes. And these black prostitutes in Cleveland start calling King out of his name. They start dissing Dr. King while he's sitting in the car. Andy, the light turns green. They pull off. And King says, turn the car around. Let's go back. I want to talk to those sisters. And Andy Young says, no, Doc, we're going to be late for this event. But Doc is in his feelings because he is looking at these women standing on the corner, and even they are going in on Dr. King in the North in Cleveland. We know in Chicago, he gets stoned. He's leading a march in Chicago. They start throwing rocks at Dr. King. That's just a long way to ask what your sense is of how King was treated when he showed up for these protests in the North, in the West, etc.
So I think we want to be careful. I think there is a myth that Northern Black people didn't like King. And obviously there are some Northern Black people who don't, similar to Southern Black people. But similar to this, again, mainstream media narrative, right, which is like King turns north after 65, is this notion that Northern Black people are angry and alienated and they don't go for nonviolence and they don't like King. Mm-hmm. And that's just not true. We see some of the most creative, largest nonviolent movements in this country happen in cities like Chicago. But who does not go for nonviolence are Northern political leaders and white Northerners. Mm-hmm. The King actually says in Chicago, right, if the protests, the school protests that happened in Chicago in 1963 and 1964 had happened somewhere else, had happened in the South, there would have been change. But the kind of resistance that white Northerners employ, and we're talking about a whole expanse of resistance. So we're both talking about the kinds of municipal resistance, right? Ignoring, gaslighting, we don't have a problem, we don't have a problem. We're also talking about violent resistance, like you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Like when King gets stoned in Chicago, it's because in the summer of 1966, they decide to, let me step back. In May of 1966, a young man, 17-year-old young man by the name of Jerome Huey, he's a Chicago teenager, mm-hmm. and he goes to apply for a job in Cicero. Cicero is a neighborhood in Chicago, and Chicago, like many northern cities, has sundown neighborhoods, right? What that means is that Black people can work in those neighborhoods, but they're not safe there after dark. They're not safe to live there. There are many such neighborhoods in Chicago, including the neighborhood that the mayor lives in Bridgeport. So this young man, Jerome Huey, has gone for a job interview at a freight loading company in Cicero. And on his way home, he's waiting at the bus stop, and he is basically beaten to death by 4 white young men. He dies in the hospital 2 days later. Mm-hmm. Now, I would bet most of the people listening to us right now know who Emmett Till was. And Emmett Till is lynched in 1955. He's a Chicago teenager lynched in Mississippi in 1955. But I would bet most of us on this call have never heard the name Jerome Huey, let alone the fact that he's lynched 11 years later in the very city of Chicago.
You'd be right. You'd be right.
And part of what that lynching does is it spurs the decision to have open housing marches in the summer of 1966 into these neighborhoods in Chicago that are like sundown neighborhoods, like Cicero, Marquette Park, Gage Park. And King, Andy Young, many of these SCLC people talk about how the mobs in Chicago are bigger than anything they've ever seen. They're more violent than anything they've ever seen. King is hit in the back of his head with a large stone or brick. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that's different, you'll remember, right? The year before, in 1965, when marchers get attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, right? Yep. The nation is outraged. Mm-hmm. And it is the beginning of the march to the Voting Rights Act, right? This violence is seen as, as un-American, that it cannot stand. Yep. And Johnson makes a speech about it. The next year, when that violence happens in Chicago, even bigger, many, many days, that violence is not treated the same way as it's treated in the South.
Hold that thought, Gene. Theo Harris will pick up that story when we come forward on Tavis Smiley.
Generous listening.
Charitable listening.
It's why everybody wants to talk to Tavis. The conversation continues when we come forward.
After producing an award-winning climate justice campaign in 2024, KBLA Talk 1580 has gone all in on its 2025 Climate Justice plus Black Health Initiative. April is Minority Health Month, and Urban Family Focus, in partnership with Providence Health Systems, presents The Heart of the Matter. Providence doctors and health equity officers will participate in informative and life-changing conversations on hypertension, health equity, behavioral health, and community engagement. Don't miss these empowering conversations on Urban Family Focus every Saturday in April at 7 and Sunday at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sponsored by Providence, Southern California's largest and most comprehensive health care network. We've got a lot to talk about on KBLA Talk 1580. Download the KBLA 1580 app or log in to KBLA1580.com. I'm Reverend Gerald, the life coach. On KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your black.
We ask seniors how to prevent Medicare scams.
My best advice, if you get a phone call, do not talk to the person. These people are well trained. Don't talk to them.
They don't know me. They're just trying to scam me.
Don't be fooled. Hang up. Just hang up.
Never give out your Medicare number.
They're going to get your number to put in a false claim.
If I get a call from someone, I don't pick up the phone. And should I pick up the phone and they ask for information, then I hang up.
How do you detect Medicare fraud?
Just like I check my credit card statements, I check my Medicare statements monthly.
Scammers can get a hold of your number, order medical devices through your account, and you're not even going to know about it if you don't look at your statement.
Check your statement every month. If you get your statement and you see something that you know you did not have done, you report it.
Call your senior Medicare Patrol.
To report Medicare fraud, call the Senior Medicare Patrol at 855-613-7080.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580, connecting you with services and solutions. The Los Angeles Regional Food Bank is on a mission to fight hunger and provide nutritious food to those in need across our community. They partner with federal, state, and local programs advocating for better policies and funding for critical hunger relief programs like Cal Fresh, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. The food bank works with coalitions and local representatives to make sure hunger is addressed in every district of LA County. They also run nutrition education campaigns, raise hunger awareness, and source nutritious food for distribution, all while supporting regulations that allow food pantries to operate safely. Want to help? Visit lafoodbank.org or call 323-234-3030 to volunteer or find a food bank near you. Together, we can ensure that no one goes hungry in Los Angeles County. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Made fresh daily in Leimert Park,
Los Angeles, California.
You're listening to Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley and Gene Theo Harris. My time is getting tight on me, Gene. You were making the point, though, that when that violence erupted in Chicago, it was not seen or covered even in the same way that violence in the South was. Is that your point?
Absolutely. That what we see is like the Chicago Tribune, Mayor Daley, but even Humphrey and Johnson blaming the marchers, right? They're the problem. These thousands of white people throwing stones, throwing firecrackers, throwing bricks, right? They're not the problem, right? So so I think there's a myth that like part of why we don't have change in the North is because you didn't have the same kind of violence in the South. But in fact, there obviously is also other kinds of tactics being used in the North, but even when Northern whites turn to violence, the violence itself is treated very differently. So unlike in 1965, when we have Johnson doing a national address after the violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, in terms of Chicago, both he and Humphrey blame the marchers. The other thing that's interesting about Chicago is all the work that King is doing with gang members. I think the last myth I think we want to talk about is this notion that King didn't have anything in common with Northern Black people, and that particularly Northern Black young people didn't like King. And when you actually look more deeply, that's just not the case. He does all this work, sitting with, working with, organizing with gang members, gang leaders, and they use phrases like the head of the Vice Lord says, you couldn't help but fall in love with him. The head of the Blackstone Rangers, Jeff Ford, wrote to me about what a good listener Dr. King was, that he would never interrupt them, that he would sit with them for hours, and that many of these gang members then marched with Dr. King, joined these, did organizing, started to kind of do work around urban renewal in their neighborhoods, all these issues, right? And so I think that, again, this last myth that I think we want to get at is that it's been convenient and comfortable to portray it as like, oh, Northern Black people didn't like nonviolence, or Northern young people didn't like Dr. King, because that's an easier thing than Northern white people were committed to segregation.
Nope. I take your point about King being a great listener and a learner. As I mentioned earlier, this story about these prostitutes in Cleveland, he made Andy Young turn that car around. He wanted to go back to talk to these sisters on that street corner so he could understand their point of view and they could understand his point of view. He wanted to hear them. He was late for where he was headed to hear what these sisters on the street corner had to say. Jean Theo Harris makes the point quite nicely in her book that King believed in the necessity of disruption and called out Northern allies who preferred order to justice. We'll wrap our conversation talking about that notion, order versus justice in the North. You're listening to Tavis Smiley.
Why does Tavis say, when we come forward? Because he's not going back. And you don't have to go back either. Forward ever, backward never. More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
If you're like me, 60 and retired, making ends meet, especially here at the supermarket and drugstore, is tough. I'm so blessed to have found benefitscheckup.org. It's a free and confidential website from the National Council on Aging that connected me to $1,200 a year in programs that help pay for food, medicine, utilities, and more. Maybe it can help you. benefitscheckup.org.
You know where you want to go in life, and City National Bank can help. City National knows the dedication it takes to build your vision for the future into a reality, and our team is here for you. We have a wide range of options to help, from personal savings accounts to interest-bearing money market savings accounts and more, all designed to help you get where you want to go. City National, here for every stage of the journey. Learn more at cnb.com. City National Bank is a subsidiary of Royal Bank of Canada, member FDIC.
Hi, I'm Dominique DePrima, and it's almost time to celebrate KBLA's 4th anniversary, coming up Juneteenth 2025. We'll be marking the achievement with 4 key community events, including a special symposium, luncheon, and brain trust hosted by me entitled The State of Black Women in Los Angeles. Keep it locked here for details on how to join us for this groundbreaking symposium examining the unique challenges, triumphs, and contributions of Black women in Los Angeles in the areas of education, healthcare, community leadership, cultural and political contributions. This public convocation will provide a critical forum to address the specific social, economic, and political realities facing Black women in LA today. We'll go live with a radio broadcast and YouTube live stream, a public discussion, and a private dialogue with some of LA's most impactful women. It's an affirmation of Black women standing at the intersection of race and gender in times of adversity while demonstrating remarkable resilience and leadership. We will listen and we will speak out and be heard, all in service of finding opportunities and solutions. Please plan to join us in celebrating our 4th anniversary by amplifying the voices of Black women. For more on our symposium and 4 events celebrating 4 years on the air, simply stay tuned or keep an eye on KBLA1580.com and help make this Juneteenth more jubilant with all of us at KBLA Talk 1580.
Let's get back to more of this rich dialogue with Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley and Jean Theo Harris. Jean, I want to close in these last 3 minutes letting you talk rather, about this, about King being willing, being courageous to tell these Northerners, even his allies, that too many of them preferred order to justice.
Yes. I mean, one of the things he's saying alongside that, right, is he's calling on a Northern liberalism that's actually liberal at home, to not just be outraged about what's happening in Alabama, but be outraged about what's happening in New York. And I think this is where we can really find, I think, a lot for today, right? Both King's willingness to call in and call out friends and allies, right? His willingness to do the hard thing. And that King, when faced with opposition, I think one of King's greatest gifts was his ability both to stand fast, but also to double down, right? That I think many of us, in the face of the kinds of opposition, right? The kinds of, because again, Northern mayors, Northern white liberals, right? Keep saying, you have no business doing this, you're wrong, who are you to say this? You're a communist, right? In LA, right, when he's doing all of this work against housing segregation in LA, he's constantly being called a communist and being picketed for being un-American, for talking about sort of the need for fair housing laws. And I think what this gives us for today, because I think, again, that comfortable story that we were talking about at the beginning, part of that comfort makes it seem like, you know, there's a kind of ease to fixing injustice, right? And I think what we see in a kind of much fuller, more accurate history of King and of the Black freedom struggle is the ways one has to take on one's allies and friends, right? That it's easier to push for change somewhere else, right? King will talk about the scripture, right? In terms of, like, again, saying to Northern liberals, before you talk about the splinter in your neighbor's eye, talk about the plank in your own eye. So taking that religious notion of hypocrisy and saying this to Northern allies. But that ability to say, even when met with unrelenting kind of criticism and pressure, King, in fact, doubles down. And so, as you know, and have written about, right, in his last months, he's building a national disruptive poor people's campaign.
That's right.
Right. And part of it is like, okay, we can't, one of the lessons of the Chicago campaign and the Cleveland is we need to go bigger. We need a national campaign, right? So that ability, we're not going to get smaller, we're going to get bigger.
Yep. What King understood better than anybody else during that era is that racism and segregation were national problems. This was not just confined to the South. They were national problems. He crisscrossed the country trying to ring the bell, trying to sound the alarm, pick your metaphor, and all of that is detailed in this new book. I could not do justice to this book even in 60 minutes. But I encourage you, implore you, in fact, to read, to learn more about the King that you think you know that you really don't. The book is called King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life of struggle outside of the South. The author of that book has been our guest in this hour. Pleased always to be in conversation with Jean Theo Harris. Thank you for your work and your witness and for letting us see the real King. I appreciate the conversation, Jean Theo Harris.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
I enjoyed it immensely. More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Bree Wood with 4 Things You Should Know with BIN News. Stocks surged on Wall Street after President Trump's surprise temporary tariff exemptions on smartphones, computers, and semiconductors. The Dow Jones rose about 400 points with the S&P 500 and NASDAQ also climbing. An all-female crew, including Black aerospace engineer Aisha Bowe and TV personality Gayle King, returned from a Blue Origin flight to the edge of space. The event was historic as the last all-female crew involved a solo Russian cosmonaut in 1963. Suspected U.S. airstrikes in Yemen killed at least 6 and wounded dozens. The Pentagon hasn't confirmed, but the military has targeted Houthi rebels for their attacks on Red Sea shipping, supporting Hamas in Gaza. And Zendaya is set to play legendary singer, the late Ronnie Spector, in her biopic, Be My Baby, How I Survived a Mascara 24/7 on the iHeartRadio app.
Southern California Edison reminds you that downed wires are dangerous. Never approach or touch a downed wire or anything in contact with it. Stay